The morning he left, May of 1898. I have told you about the morning, the uniform that did not fit, the porch, the apron, the 2 words. What I have not told you is what the morning looked like, which matters because I see it every day. Every morning for 29 years I see it. The light was gold. May mornings on the Georgia coast have a particular quality of light that I have not seen anywhere else, though I have not been many places. The light comes through the live oaks, and the moss filters it, and it arrives on the ground, dappled and warm, and the air smells of marsh and jasmine, because the jasmine blooms in May, and the smell is so sweet it is almost sickening, and I associate that sweetness now with loss, because that is what the morning smelled like when my son left, and the smell has never recovered its innocence. He hugged me. He was larger than me by then, had been larger for a decade. And when he hugged me, his arms went all the way around, and my face was against his chest, and I could hear his heart. And his heart was beating fast because he was excited. He was going to a war. He was going to be a soldier. And the heartbeat was strong and fast and reliable, and I stood there with my ear against his chest, hearing the heart that would stop 3 months later in a tent in Tampa. And I did not know it was counting down. I thought it was counting up. I thought there were years and decades of heartbeats remaining, and there were not. There were approximately 8 million remaining, which sounds like a lot until you calculate that the heart beats 100,000 times a day, and 8 million is 80 days, and 80 days is not August. 80 days from May is August, and that is exactly when he died. I kissed his cheek. I said, "Be careful." He said, "I will, Mama, don't worry." He walked down the path, the live oaks, the Spanish moss, the gold light, the jasmine, the wagon on the road, the other boys, the dust, the sound of the wagon moving away, the sound diminishing, the silence returning, the creek behind the house making its sounds, the water moving in the channel, the oysters clicking on the beds, the ordinary sounds of a morning on Skidaway Island that would never be ordinary again. He wrote 2 letters from the camp. The first described the journey and the camp, and the other men and the food, which was bad, and the heat, which was worse. He sounded cheerful. He sounded like Arden. The second letter was shorter. He mentioned that some men in the camp had fallen ill. He said the water was not good. He said they were boiling it now. He said not to worry. Those words again, "Don't worry," the same words he had said on the porch, "Don't worry," as though worry were optional, as though a mother could choose not to worry about a son in a camp where the water was making men sick. The telegram came on a Tuesday afternoon in August. I was on the porch. I was shelling peas. The specific activity is important because I have not shelled peas since that afternoon, cannot touch them. The feel of the pods splitting under my thumb, the small round peas rolling into the bowl, this sensation is connected to the moment the messenger appeared on the path, and I knew before he reached the porch, knew from the paper in his hand, knew from his face, knew the way the body knows things before the mind permits them. The way a fisherman's wife knows when the boat is not coming back, the way a mother knows when the counting has stopped. The War Department regrets to inform you that Private Arden C. Barnwell died of typhoid fever at Camp Tampa on August the 7th, 1898. The language was standard. The grief was not. I have been composing the goodbye for 29 years. I will try again now. Draft the first. I try to tell him I was proud, but proud is a word that has been used for too many things and has lost its specificity. I was not proud of him in the general way, the way one is proud of a son who does well, the broad, vague pride that could apply to anyone. I was proud of him in the specific way, proud that he carried the heavy bucket instead of making 2 trips, proud that he built the leaking bateau and fixed it and built a better one, proud that he brought oysters to Mrs. Cuthbert down the creek because she was old and could not tong her own, and he did not tell anyone he did this, just did it, every week, a bucket of oysters on her porch, and I knew, because I saw him go and I saw him come back without the bucket, and I said nothing because saying something would have embarrassed him, and the doing was sufficient without the naming. I was proud of the throwing of the cast net in a perfect circle. I was proud of the way he treated the water, taking what he needed and leaving the rest, an ethic he learned from Caleb but made his own. I was proud of him specifically, and the specific pride is what I should have said and did not say, and be careful does not contain it. Draft the second. I try to tell him he was loved, but I love you is 3 words that have been applied to so many situations and so many people that they arrive depleted, like currency that has been in circulation so long the faces on the coins are worn smooth. I did not love him in the worn smooth way. I loved him in the way that a woman loves the person she made inside her body, the person she felt kick and roll and hiccup before he was born, the person she pushed into the world through pain she would repeat 1,000 times for the privilege of seeing his face. I loved him in the mornings when he was small and asleep, and I stood in the doorway of his room and watched his chest rise and fall and felt each time a relief so profound it was almost gratitude. The relief of he is still here, he is still breathing, the world has not taken him yet. That love, that specific, bodily, irrational love that does not diminish when the child grows larger than the mother but intensifies, because the larger the person, the more there is to lose. Draft the third. I try to warn him. Don't drink the water unless it is boiled. Don't sleep in wet clothes. Don't volunteer for extra duty when your body is tired. Eat what they give you, even if it is bad, because your body needs fuel, and fuel is fuel regardless of taste. Write to me. Write to me every week. Tell me everything, even the bad things, especially the bad things, because the bad things are the things I can help with from here, from this porch, from this distance, even if the help is only words written on paper and sent south to a camp in Florida where the water is killing boys who should be home on their creeks pulling shrimp from the tide. These warnings would not have saved him. Typhoid does not yield to maternal advice, but saying them would have meant I tried. Saying them would have meant the last thing he heard from me was not a 2-word platitude, but a mother's specific, desperate, practical love translated into instructions for survival. Draft the fourth. I try to say goodbye, the word goodbye, and I cannot say it. I have tried for 29 years, and the word will not come because goodbye is a closing, and I have not closed. The door of this house is open, not literally. Literally, it is closed against the evening and the insects and the marsh air. But the door through which Arden left is open in me, has been open since May of 1898, and I cannot close it because closing it would mean he is not coming through it, and I know he's not coming through it. I have known for 29 years. But knowing and closing are different operations, and I can perform the first but not the second. I know he is dead. I cannot say goodbye. The knowing and the not saying goodbye coexist in me the way the land and the water coexist on this coast, each taking turns, each yielding to the other, neither one winning. I am going to stop drafting now. I have been drafting for 29 years, and the goodbye will not be written, because the goodbye is not a thing that can be written. It is a thing that must be spoken to a living person who can hear you, and the person I need to speak it to is not living and cannot hear me, and no amount of beautiful language arranged on the air of a porch on Skidaway Island will reach a grave in Tampa. I cannot compose what cannot be delivered. I can only keep trying, and the trying is what I have instead of the goodbye, and the trying will have to be enough. Caleb drowned in 1919. A squall in the Sound. His boat capsized. They found him the next day on the mud flat at low tide. The water took him the way it takes everything on this coast, casually, without malice, the way a tide takes a shell. I grieved for Caleb, and the grieving was clean because I had said goodbye to Caleb properly, had said it every morning when he went to the boat, because a fisherman's wife says goodbye every morning, Knowing the water is not a promise, it is an arrangement, and arrangements can be broken. I said goodbye to Caleb 1,000 times. I said it once to Arden, and the once was be careful, and it was not enough, and nothing will ever make it enough. Nettie lives in Savannah now. Boone works the oyster beds from a boat he built himself, built properly, no leaks, though I cannot help thinking Arden's leaking bateau was the better boat because the effort in it was more visible. They visit, they bring their children. The children play in the creek the way Arden played in it, and I watch them from the porch the way I watched Arden from the porch, and the watching is the same, and the creek is the same, and the mud is the same, and the boy is gone, and the water keeps coming in and going out as though nothing has changed, and nothing has changed except everything. I am 84 years old. Every morning I walk to the creek at low tide. I stand on the mud flat where Arden used to tong oysters. The mud is soft under my feet, the same mud that was soft under his feet, and if I stand still enough and the light is right, I can see the depressions in the mud that might be his footprints, or might be mine, or might be the tide's own markings. I cannot tell. The mud does not hold impressions long enough to distinguish between the feet of the living and the memory of the dead. I stand there. I do not speak. I do not compose. I do not draft another version of the goodbye. I just stand where he stood, and I let the tide come in around my ankles the way it came in around his ankles when he was 12 and 16 and 26 and alive, and the water is cold and the water is salt, and the water does not know that the boy who stood here is gone, and the mother who stands here is old, and the space between them is 29 years of unsaid words and a 2-word goodbye that was not enough. The tide comes in, the tide goes out. I stand. This is not a goodbye. It is the opposite of a goodbye. It is a refusal to leave the last place where he was fully himself, the mud and the water and the oysters and the cast net opening like a flower over the channel. I refuse to leave this place. I will stand in it until I cannot stand any more, and then they will carry me up the bluff, and I will be done, and the creek will keep going, and the tide will keep coming, and the oysters will keep clicking on the beds, and none of it will know that Arden was here and that his mother was here, and that between them there was a goodbye that was never said properly, and that will now never be said because some things cannot be completed, they can only be carried. And I have carried this one for 29 years, and it is not lighter, and it will not get lighter, and I am not putting it down. Be careful, Arden. That is what I said. I am 84 years old, and I am still saying it. Be careful, as though saying it enough times might finally make it enough. It will not, but I am saying it anyway. To the creek and the mud and the tide and the air and the morning and the jasmine and the moss and the oaks and whatever is left of you in this place where you were a boy with a bucket of oysters and the whole world ahead of you, and a mother on the porch who should have said more and who is saying it now, too late, always too late, still saying it, still trying, still standing in the mud where you stood, still here. Be careful, that is what I said. 2 words. That was my goodbye to my son on a May morning in 1898 when he walked down the path from this house in a uniform that did not fit him properly and climbed onto a wagon with other young men who were going to win a war that would last a few weeks and come home heroes. And I stood on the porch with my hands in my apron and I said, "Be careful," as though careful were something you could be against typhoid fever in a camp in Tampa, as though careful could stop contaminated water from entering a body that had been raised on clean salt water and did not know how to defend itself against the kind that comes from a ditch. Be careful. That is what you say to a child reaching for a hot pan. That is what you say to a man climbing a ladder. That is not what you say to your son when he is leaving for a war. Even a small war, even a short war, even a war that everyone assures you will be concluded before the summer is out, you say something more. You say everything you have been accumulating across 26 years of watching this person grow from a creature that fit in the bend of your arm to a man taller than you, with shoulders wider than the door frame and hands that could haul a shrimp net for hours without tiring. You say I love you and I am proud of you and come home to me, and I need you to understand that the world without you in it is not a world I am interested in occupying. You say these things, or you say whatever version of these things your particular vocabulary permits, and you make sure the last sound he hears from your mouth is not "be careful," but something that will stay with him, something he can carry, something that will sit in his chest when the nights are bad and remind him that there is a woman on a porch on Skidaway Island who is waiting for him specifically, not for a soldier, not for a hero, for him, her son, Arden, the boy who brought her oysters. I did not say any of this. I said, "Be careful." He said, "I will, Mama, don't worry." And he walked down the path, and the live oaks closed behind him, and I went inside and finished shelling the peas I'd been shelling when he came to tell me the wagon was ready, and I did not run after him, and I did not call out, and I let 2 words stand as the entire summary of 26 years of motherhood. Be careful, as though those words could have done anything, as though any words could do anything against a fever in a Florida camp. But they were the wrong words, and I knew they were the wrong words while I was saying them, and I said them anyway because the right words were too large and the morning was too ordinary. And I believed there would be other mornings. There were not other mornings. That is the thing about goodbye that nobody explains to you in advance. You do not know it is a goodbye while it is happening. You think it is a Tuesday. You think it is a morning like any other morning, and the person leaving is leaving the way they have left before, and will leave again, and will return the way they have returned before, and you will have time, always more time, to say what needs saying. And then the time runs out, and the words you did not say become the words you cannot say, and the distance between did not and cannot is permanent and uncrossable, and you stand on one side of it for the rest of your life holding a sentence you never finished. My name is Drusilla Faye Barnwell. People have called me Drew since before I can remember. I was born on the 9th of July, 1843, in Chatham County, Georgia, on the coast, on the edge of the marsh, where the land gives up trying to be land and lets the water take over. I grew up between the solid and the liquid, on ground that was firm at low tide and submerged at high, and I have lived my entire life in that in-between, which has turned out to be appropriate because I have spent the last 29 years in an in-between of a different kind, between the said and the unsaid, between the goodbye I gave and the goodbye I owe. I should tell you about the water, because the water is part of this story, the way it is part of everything on the Georgia coast. You cannot separate a low country person from the water any more than you can separate the salt from the marsh. The water is in everything. It is in the air, which is so humid most of the year that breathing feels like drinking. It is in the ground, which is saturated, spongy, unreliable under your feet. It is in the creeks that wind through the marsh grass in channels so complex that only people who grew up on them can navigate them without getting lost. The water feeds you. Shrimp, oysters, crab, fish, the whole larder of the coast provided by the tides twice a day, coming in and going out, bringing food and taking it, an arrangement so reliable that you forget it is an arrangement and begin to think of it as a promise. The water also takes. I know this now. I knew it before Arden because my father was a fisherman, and fishermen's wives know that the water takes, have always known it, have stood on bluffs and docks and porches watching boats go out and counting the hours until the boats come back, and knowing, always knowing, that one day the counting will not end with a boat rounding the point. But I thought the water's taking was limited to the water itself, to storms and tides and currents. I did not know that water could take my son in a camp 300 miles from the coast, in a place where the water was not salt and clean, but stagnant and fouled. Water that sat in ditches and bred fever and killed more American soldiers than Spanish bullets ever did. My father was Hoke Cogburn. He fished the sounds and creeks around Skidaway Island and farmed a few acres of sandy soil on the island's western bluff. We were not wealthy. The low country had wealthy people. the planters on the river plantations who grew rice and sea island cotton with enslaved labor, but the Cogburns were not among them. We were coast people, water people, the kind who smelled of salt and bait and who washed the pluff mud from their feet every evening on the porch before coming inside. My mother was Elda Cogburn, born Elda Ravenel, from a Huguenot family that had been on the Georgia coast since the colonial period, and that had started with land and ended with a net and a bateau and the knowledge of where the shrimp ran in September. The war came when I was 18. I will not dwell on the war, because the war I survived is not the war that took my son, and confusing the two would dishonor both. I will say only that Savannah fell to Sherman in December of 1864, and that the Low Country was occupied, and that the Cogburn family, having nothing worth taking except fish and oysters, survived the occupation with less damage than those who had more. The marsh provided. The creek provided. When the soldiers took our chickens, we ate shrimp. When they took the shrimp nets, we tonged oysters. The water was not confiscated, because you cannot confiscate the tide, and the tide was our true provision, more reliable than any crop, more faithful than any government, coming in and going out regardless of who occupied the land above it. I married Caleb Barnwell in 1870. Caleb was a shrimper. He operated a small boat out of Thunderbolt, working the sounds between Skidaway and Wassaw Islands. He was brown from the sun, lean from the work, quiet in the way that watermen are quiet, which is different from the quiet of land men. Land quiet is an absence of speech. Water quiet is a fullness of listening. Caleb listened to the water the way some men listen to music, with an attention that was both professional and devotional. He heard things in the tide that I could not hear. He knew when the shrimp were running before the shrimp knew it. I loved him for this. I loved him for the competence of his listening and the reliability of his presence. He came home every evening. He came home. Arden was born on the 3rd of March, 1872, in the house where I'm sitting now, the house Caleb built on the bluff above the tidal creek on the western side of Skidaway. He was born in the back bedroom, and the window was open because it was an unseasonably warm March, and through the window I could hear the creek and I could smell the marsh, that particular smell of pluff mud and salt and decomposition that is not a pleasant smell by any standard except the standard of a woman who has lived in it her whole life and who associates it with home. And my son was born into that smell, and it became part of him the way it was part of me. He was a water child. From the earliest age, he moved toward water the way other children move toward their mothers, instinctively, without calculation, drawn by something that preceded thought. I could not keep him from the creek. By the time he was 4, he was wading in the shallows at low tide, his feet sinking into the pluff mud, his hands reaching for the fiddler crabs that scattered at his approach. By 6, he was swimming, taught by Caleb in the deeper channel where the creek ran between the oyster beds. By 8, he was tonging oysters himself, standing in the bateau with the long-handled tongs, working the beds the way Caleb worked them, the way Caleb's father had worked them, pulling the clusters from the bottom and breaking them apart and sorting the keepers from the shells. I want to tell you about specific moments because the moments are what I have been trying to put into the goodbye for 29 years, and they will not fit. They are too large for words, but I will try again because trying is what I do now, have done for 29 years, will do until the trying stops. Arden, at 8 years old, he came up from the creek one afternoon with a bucket of oysters he had tonged himself. The bucket was too heavy for him. He was struggling with it. He could have left half of them on the flat and come back for them. Instead, he carried the whole bucket, because the whole bucket was the accomplishment, and half a bucket was half an accomplishment, and Arden did not do things by halves. He came up the path to the porch, red-faced, arms shaking from the weight, and he put the bucket down at my feet, and he looked at me, and his face said everything his mouth did not say, which was, "Look what I did." I did this. I went to the creek and I brought this back, and it is for you. I should have said, I am proud of you. I should have said, this is the finest bucket of oysters anyone has ever brought me. I should have knelt down and put my hands on his face and looked him in the eyes and said, you are extraordinary, Arden Barnwell, and I am fortunate beyond description to be your mother. I said, those are good ones. Go wash your hands for supper. Those are good ones. Not wrong, not unkind, but insufficient, always insufficient. I was a practical woman, raised by practical people in a practical place, and the practical language I spoke did not contain the words for what I felt when my 8-year-old son brought me a bucket of oysters he had worked for, and I have spent 29 years trying to find those words, and I am finding them now, too late, finding them and speaking them into the air where Arden cannot hear them, because Arden is in a grave in Tampa that I have visited once and will not visit again. Because Tampa is not where my son belongs. My son belongs on the creek, in the water, in the mud, in the salt air that made him. Before we continue, a quick word. I've released 14 full recordings that will never be on YouTube. These are the voices too personal, too raw to share publicly, completely unedited, nothing cut. If you want access, the link is in the description. It's called The Lost Recordings, and getting it helps us keep making these videos. All right, back to the story. Arden at 12. He built a bateau. Cypress planks he salvaged from a collapsed dock on the north end of the island. He sawed them and planed them and fitted them and sealed the joints with pine tar, and he launched the boat in the creek behind the house, and it leaked. It leaked badly. Water came through every seam like the pine tar was decorative rather than functional. Arden bailed and paddled and bailed and paddled, and the boat sat lower and lower in the creek. And Caleb stood on the bluff, watching with an expression that was trying very hard not to be a smile. The boat did not sink. It achieved a kind of equilibrium, taking on water at a rate that was barely managed by Arden's bailing, floating in the technical sense while sinking in the practical sense, and Arden paddled it 50 yards down the creek and 50 yards back and came ashore soaked and triumphant. It floats, he said. Caleb said, that is one word for it. And then Caleb showed him how to reseal the joints, and the next day the boat floated properly, and Arden used it for 4 years until he outgrew it and built a larger one. That boat, I think about that boat more than I should, the first one, the leaking one, the one that worked badly and worked anyway because the boy in it refused to let it not work. That was Arden. He did not accept failure. He did not accept insufficiency. He took what he had and he made it function by sheer force of refusal, and when it still did not function properly, he fixed it and tried again, and the trying was the thing. The trying was always the thing, the absolute unwillingness to stop trying. He should have tried harder to stay alive. That is the thought I have been unable to prevent for 29 years, the thought that arrives uninvited and unjust and impossible to evict. He should have tried harder, as though trying could have defeated typhoid, as though the same stubbornness that kept a leaking bateau afloat could have kept a body afloat against a fever that killed men regardless of how stubborn they were. It is an irrational thought. I am a practical woman, and the thought is irrational, and I think it anyway because grief is not rational, and the irrational thoughts are the ones that cut deepest because you cannot argue with them. You can only endure them. Arden at 16, tall by then, taller than Caleb, brown from the sun in a way that was permanent, the brown not a tan but a stain, the sun's mark on a body that lived under it year-round. He could throw a cast net in a perfect circle, the net opening in the air like a flower, like a prayer, spreading flat over the water and sinking. And when he pulled it up, it was full of shrimp, silver, and jumping, alive, and his hands were quick, sorting the shrimp from the grass and the debris, filling the bucket, his movements so practiced they were automatic, hands doing what hands were born to do. I watched him from the porch. I watched him from the kitchen window. I watched him the way mothers watch sons who are becoming men, with a mixture of pride and alarm, pride at what they are becoming, and alarm at the speed of the becoming and the knowledge that the becoming will eventually result in a leaving, because sons leave. They go, they walk down paths and climb onto wagons and go to places where their mothers cannot follow. The war. February of 1898, the Maine blew up in Havana Harbor, and by April the country was at war with Spain, and by May the recruiting wagons were rolling through the countryside, and Arden, who was 26 and unmarried and strong and possessed of the uncomplicated patriotism that young men who have not been to war possess, enlisted. I did not argue effectively. This is another entry in the catalogue of things I should have done differently and did not. I could have argued. I could have told him about the war I survived as a girl, about what war actually is beneath the flags and the music, about the boys who marched away from Chatham County in 1861 and came back in boxes or came back in pieces or did not come back at all. I could have told him that war is not what the posters say it is, that the posters show men with bayonets and flags, and the reality is dysentery and boredom and fear and men dying of things that have nothing to do with the enemy. I could have told him this, and perhaps he would have listened, and perhaps he would not have, and perhaps the telling would have changed nothing, but at least I would have tried, the way Arden tried with the leaking bateau. At least I would have bailed. I did not bail. I let the water come in. I let him go because the war was supposed to be small. Cuba was far away. The newspapers said it would be over in weeks. Everyone said this. The recruiters said it. The men at the store in Thunderbolt said it. The minister said God would protect our boys and God would deliver a swift victory and our boys would come home by autumn with stories that would entertain us for years. I believed this because believing it was easier than the alternative, and because I did not know yet that believing easy things is a form of negligence when the stakes are your son's life.